There was a time when one of Britain's most familiar factories did not make weapons, engines, ships, or aircraft. It made the pieces of them: tiny fuselages, plastic wings, tank tracks still joined to the sprue, battleships in sections, cockpits without pilots, wheels no bigger than a thumbnail. And from those fragments, millions of children built a version of the modern world on bedroom tables, kitchen counters and newspaper-covered floors. The name was Airfix. At its height, Airfix was not just another toy brand. It was part of the atmosphere of post-war Britain. It sat in Woolworths. It appeared in catalogues. It lived in drawers alongside glue, paint, and broken propellers. For many people, the word Airfix became almost interchangeable with the idea of a plastic model kit itself. The company produced aircraft, ships, cars, soldiers, railway accessories, military vehicles, and more. By the 1970s, Airfix was producing around 20 million kits a year, and in 1971 it acquired Meccano and Dinky, becoming one of the largest toy manufacturers in Britain. But the strange thing about Airfix is that its power was never only in the finished object. The magic was in the unbuilt kit. Inside the bag or box was a promise. A child opened it and saw not a toy but a task. A Spitfire did not arrive ready to fly across the carpet. It had to be cut out, sanded, glued, held in place while the cement set. The builder had to wait, had to read, had to choose colors, had to fail a little, had to learn that the world was made of parts. That was the quiet genius of Airfix. It turned industrial Britain into something personal. It took the symbols of aviation, engineering, war, transport, and empire, and shrank them into objects that could be assembled by hand. In a country still surrounded by the memory of factories, docks, airfields, and workshops, Airfix gave children a way to rehearse the act of making. And then, slowly, the system around it began to change. The children changed. The shops changed. The economics changed. Manufacturing changed. Britain changed. The factory in Wandsworth, once part of a living industrial landscape along the River Wandle, lost its central place in the story. In 1981, Airfix collapsed into receivership. The brand was rescued, sold, moved, and later rescued again. Production left London. The name survived. The factory did not. So the deeper question is not only how Airfix declined, it is how a company that once taught Britain how to build in miniature became a symbol of a country that was forgetting how much making once meant. The Airfix story begins in London in 1939, at the edge of war. Its founder, Nicholas Cove, was a Hungarian refugee who began with a business that had little to do with scale models. The early Airfix made rubber-inflated toys. Even the name came from that original idea, fixing air into products. Combined with Cove's belief that a successful company name should appear near the beginning of business directories, there is something almost accidental about that beginning. Airfix did not emerge from an aviation firm. It did not begin as a patriotic project to preserve Britain's aircraft in miniature. It began with material, with manufacturing, with the basic question of what could be made cheaply and sold widely. Rubber toys were light, accessible, and simple. But the war changed the economics of rubber. Scarcity pushed the company toward other materials and techniques. Like many British manufacturers of the period, Airfix adapted not because of a grand vision, but because survival required it. By 1947, Airfix had become a leading maker of plastic pocket combs. That detail matters. Before Airfix became emotional, nostalgic, and collectible, it was practical. It understood molding. It understood mass production. It understood how a small object could be made in quantity and sold at a price ordinary people could afford. A comb was not glamorous, but it taught the company the grammar of plastic. Plastic was the real foundation of Airfix. It was cheap enough to democratize making. It could hold detail. It could be injected into molds. It could turn a complicated object into repeatable parts. In the right hands, it could make a child feel close to an aircraft, a ship, or a machine that would otherwise belong to museums, airfields, factories, or war stories. Airfix's future was already present in those combs, even if nobody yet knew it. The company had learned how to make small plastic objects. What it still needed was the object that would reveal the true purpose of that skill. That object was not a Spitfire. It was a tractor. In 1949, Airfix was commissioned to make a promotional plastic model of the Ferguson TE20 tractor. The model was originally assembled before distribution, but assembling the components proved slow and costly. That difficulty pushed Nicholas Cove toward a simple but transformative idea: sell the model in kit form and let the customer do the assembly. This was the hinge in the story. The problem was not artistic. It was industrial. Assembly took time. Time cost money. A finished miniature had to pass through hands inside the factory before it could pass into the hands of a customer. But a kit shifted part of the labor outward. The factory made the pieces. The buyer completed the product. On paper, that looked like efficiency. In practice, it created a new kind of relationship between manufacturer and customer. The customer was no longer just a consumer. The customer became the final worker in the production chain. A child at a table became, in miniature, the last station on the line. The sprue was the factory's unfinished sentence. Glue completed it. That is why the Airfix kit was more than a toy. It was an invitation into process. A finished toy asks to be used. A kit asks to be understood. Before the model could exist, the builder had to interpret the diagram, identify parts, test patience, and accept imperfection. Wings could go on unevenly. Glue could frost the canopy. Paint could run. Decals could fold over themselves and become useless, but those mistakes were part of the education. The Ferguson tractor also connected Airfix to a broader post-war world. Britain was rebuilding. Agriculture, engineering, manufacturing, and mechanization mattered deeply to the national imagination. A tractor was not fantasy, it was practical modernity. It represented work, production, land, recovery, and machines that did useful things. But the tractor was still a promotional object. The next step was to make a kit, not because another company wanted it, but because the public did. That step came through Woolworths. The first true mass-market Airfix kit was the Golden Hind, released in 1952 and sold through Woolworths for 2 shillings. The following year came the famous BTK Spitfire, the first in a long line of Airfix Spitfire kits. This is where Airfix found its public. The price mattered. The place mattered. Woolworths was not an elite model shop. It was a mass retailer, a place where ordinary families could encounter small temptations. Airfix did not begin by asking people to enter a specialist hobby. It put the hobby where people already were. A 2-shilling kit could be bought, carried home and opened like a secret. The packaging was part of the ritual. Early Airfix kits were often simple: a plastic bag, a paper header, instructions printed on the back. The economy of it was essential. The object did not need luxury presentation. The value was inside, in the parts and the future shape they implied. The Golden Hind also showed something important about Airfix's imagination. It was not limited to modern war machines. It could reach backward into maritime history, into empire exploration and national myth. But the Spitfire gave Airfix something even more powerful: a machine already loaded with memory. For post-war Britain, the Spitfire was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of survival. It belonged to the Battle of Britain, to stories of pilots, airfields, and national endurance. When Airfix turned it into a kit, it made that symbol domestic. A child could hold it, paint it, damage it, repair it, and suspend it from a bedroom ceiling. This was industrial memory made affordable. The company's genius was that it did not need to explain the emotion. It placed the parts in the bag and trusted the culture to do the rest. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Airfix was no longer just testing a format. It was building a world: aircraft, ships, cars, figures, railway accessories, catalogues, magazines, and a growing network of model builders who were not only buying objects, but entering a system. And that system needed a physical home for Airfix. That home became Wandsworth. Airfix moved into premises at the Riverside site in Wandsworth around 1950 and expanded as its model kit range became more popular. The site itself already carried layers of industrial history. It had housed earlier manufacturing connected to Columbia Gramophone and later A.H. Hunt, a maker of radio capacitors. After Hunt moved out in 1969, Airfix took over and adapted former Hunt premises. This is the part of the Airfix story that can be too easily missed. A brand can travel. Her logo can be printed anywhere. A mold can be moved. But a factory belongs to a place. The Wandsworth site stood within an older industrial geography, shaped by the River Wandle, workshops, warehouses, transport links, and working communities. The buildings had already witnessed different eras of production: sound recording, electrical components, and then plastic models. Airfix did not arrive on empty ground. It entered a landscape where making had been layered over making. Inside that world, the Airfix factory turned imagination into repeatable form. The sound would not have been the roar of a shipyard or the hammering of heavy steel. It was a different kind of industry: plastic granules, injection molding, tooling, packing, cataloging, dispatch. The products were small, but the operation behind them was serious. Molds had to be cut with precision. Parts had to fit. Instructions had to make sense. Artwork had to sell the dream before the kit was built. A model kit is a strange industrial product because it must be incomplete by design. Too finished, and it loses the purpose of the hobby. Too crude, and it disappoints. The factory had to produce not merely plastic parts, but controlled possibility. That possibility became part of British childhood. Families knew the smell of polystyrene cement. Tables were protected with old newspapers. Paint tins were opened and not always closed properly. Instructions were folded, stained, ignored, and rediscovered too late. A kit could occupy a rainy afternoon, a school holiday, or a long winter evening. It could also become a lesson in frustration. Airfix entered homes not as a spectacle, but as a practice. And as the 1960s arrived, that practice expanded into a culture. The 1960s and 1970s were the years when Airfix became a giant of the hobby. The company launched catalogs. Airfix magazine appeared. The range expanded, and in 1962, Airfix bought the Kitmaster railway construction kits. Later, in the 1970s, Airfix introduced larger scales and reached production levels of around 20 million kits a year. This was not only a business expansion. It was the construction of an ecosystem. A child might begin with a small aircraft and then move to ships, tanks, figures, locomotives, or cars. A catalogue was not simply a sales list. It was a map of possible worlds. Each page showed what could be built next. The hobby encouraged accumulation. One kit led to another. Paints led to brushes. Brushes led to display shelves. Display shelves led to pride, comparison, and expertise. Airfix magazine added another layer. It turned private hobby into shared culture. It suggested that the builder was part of something larger than a single bedroom table. Techniques could be learned. Historical details could be discussed. Mistakes could be corrected in the next build. The box art also mattered enormously. Before the plastic parts were touched, the image on the front did the emotional work. Aircraft dived through smoke. Ships cut through rough water. Tanks advanced across hostile ground. The artwork gave motion to objects that were, inside the box, still flat grey pieces attached to frames. This was one of Airfix's great strengths. It understood that modelling was not only about accuracy, it was about atmosphere. At the same time, the company was expanding beyond its original simplicity. Airfix was no longer just a kit maker. It moved into other toy businesses, including Meccano and Dinky after the collapse of Lines Brothers. That made Airfix larger, but it also made it more exposed. The company was now connected to a wider toy market, broader inventories, seasonal pressures, and divisions that did not all behave like plastic kits. Growth brought prestige. It also brought weight. The larger Airfix became, the more vulnerable it was to forces beyond the Wandsworth factory. Currency movements, imports, changing children's habits, interest rates, recession, and new forms of entertainment. The plastic model kit still carried cultural power, but the world around it was beginning to move faster than the old system could comfortably manage. Airfix had mastered the age of glue and patience. It was about to face an age of electronics and acceleration. The decline of Airfix was not caused by one simple mistake. That is what makes the story important. It was not merely that children stopped caring. It was not merely that management made bad choices. It was not merely imports, recession, or currency. It was the combined pressure of several changes arriving at once. By 1981, Airfix was under severe financial pressure. Contemporary reporting summarized in the Wandle Industrial Museum Bulletin pointed to a cluster of causes: the strength of the pound damaging exports, recession affecting toy sales, cheaper imports from the Far East, electronic toys, a reduction in the number of children during the 1970s, and high interest rates that made it expensive to carry stock between seasonal sales periods. Each of those causes attacked a different part of the Airfix system. A strong pound made British-made products harder to sell abroad. Cheaper imports challenged the cost base. Recession squeezed family spending. Electronic toys changed expectations, offering movement, sound, lights, and instant response. Demographic change narrowed the child market. High interest rates punished companies that had to finance large inventories before Christmas. Airfix depended on a slower rhythm. Design the kit, cut the mold, produce the parts, package them, ship them to retailers, wait for the buyer. Then the buyer waits again while building the model. The whole experience was based on delay, anticipation, and manual completion. But consumer culture was shifting toward immediacy. That does not mean the Airfix kit suddenly became obsolete. Many people continued to love it. But mass childhood culture was changing. Television, video games, electronic toys, and imported products were competing for attention. A kit required concentration. It required space. It required adult tolerance of mess, glue, and paint. It rewarded patience at exactly the moment patience was becoming less central to children's entertainment. The company's expansion also made the crisis more dangerous. A small specialist brand might have retreated. A large toy group with multiple divisions, stock burdens, and debt pressures had less room to breathe. The very ambition that had made Airfix seem powerful now made it fragile. The hidden weakness was not that Airfix had no value. It was that its value was locked inside a manufacturing and retail system built for another era. In 1981, Airfix went bust and was purchased by General Mills. Production was switched to France. That sentence sounds simple, but behind it was a profound break. When the assets and brand moved on, Airfix did not disappear from shelves. The name continued. Kits continued. The red logo retained its emotional force. But something had changed. The old relationship between brand, factory, workforce, and place had been severed. For Wandsworth, this was not just a corporate event. It was part of a broader disappearance of urban industry from London. Factories that had once made records, capacitors, and model kits were becoming remnants, redevelopment sites, or business centers. The city was changing its economic language. Manufacturing was no longer the assumed future of such places. The molds were among the most important objects in the Airfix story. A mold is not glamorous to the buyer. It is heavy, technical, and hidden. But in a plastic kit company, the mold is memory-made industrial. It contains the shape that can be repeated thousands, sometimes millions of times. A tool cut in one decade can keep producing childhoods in another. When production moved, the molds carried the brand's physical DNA away from its original factory world. The irony is that Airfix could survive precisely because the brand and tools were portable. A factory town tied to a mine or steelworks may die when the site closes. A model kit brand can be transferred, reboxed, relicenced, revived, and sold again. But that portability also reveals the loss. The name can continue after the local system has vanished. Under General Mills, Airfix entered a new corporate world. Later, Humbrol acquired Airfix in 1986. The logic of that acquisition made sense. Humbrol paints and adhesives belonged naturally beside Airfix kits. But the company was now moving through owners. Not growing from its old factory base, the identity remained British. The production story became more complicated. Airfix's later history is a story of survival through transformation. Humbrol owned the brand until its own collapse in 2006. Hornby then bought Airfix and Humbrol for $2.6 million, bringing Airfix under the control of another famous British hobby name. Once again, the brand was rescued. The public reaction showed how much Airfix still meant. This was not a normal consumer product disappearing from a shelf. It was tied to memory, childhood, craft, and national identity. People did not merely remember owning Airfix. They remembered building it. That distinction is everything. To build something is to leave evidence of yourself inside it. A badly painted wing, a crooked undercarriage, a fingerprint trapped in glue. These are flaws, but they are also proof of contact. Airfix models carried the marks of the people who made them. That made the brand unusually intimate. A die-cast toy might be owned. An Airfix kit was participated in. Under Hornby, Airfix entered another phase. The brand was revitalized with reissues, new kits, digital design, and attempts to reach both experienced modelers and younger builders. In 2009, Hornby began switching kit design to CAD, and later, Airfix introduced ranges such as Quick Build to attract younger children with pre-painted clip-together kits. This was not a return to the old Airfix. It was adaptation. The modern hobby market is more fragmented, more adult, more online, and more global. Many builders are no longer children buying a cheap kit from Woolworths. They are adult enthusiasts, collectors, historians, painters, and specialists. They expect accuracy, detail, better fit, better research, and higher production standards. The simple mass-market pocket money kit still has emotional power, but the center of gravity has shifted. Airfix had to become both heritage and product. That is a difficult balance. Lean too much into nostalgia, and the brand becomes a museum of itself. Chase novelty too aggressively, and it loses the emotional continuity that makes people care. The challenge is to keep the old promise alive while changing the method of delivery. Today, the Wandsworth factory is no longer the heart of Airfix production. Sources describe modern manufacturing as outsourced, with design and packaging retained in the UK. The name survived. The old industrial world behind it did not. The Airfix story matters because it is not only about toys. It is about the disappearance of a certain relationship between industry, childhood, and national imagination. Airfix taught generations that objects had structure. A plane was not just a silhouette. It had wings, fuselage halves, cockpit glazing, landing gear, propeller, decals, and paint schemes. A ship was not just a ship. It was hull, deck, mast, guns, funnels, and rigging. Even when simplified, the model trained the eye to see machines as assemblies. That kind of attention is culturally important. In a world of sealed devices, smooth screens, and products designed not to be opened, Airfix belonged to an older idea. That understanding begins when you see the parts. The kit did not hide its construction. It displayed it. It made process visible. But Airfix also shows how fragile industrial culture can be. A company can dominate a market and still be vulnerable to forces it cannot fully control. Currency, interest rates, demographics, imports, changing leisure habits, ownership structures, and technology can converge until a once obvious business model becomes unstable. Airfix did not fall because its products had no meaning. It fell because meaning alone cannot pay for stock, factories, tooling, wages, distribution, and debt. That is the hard lesson. Nostalgia remembers the smell of glue. Industry remembers the cost of keeping the shelves full. The Wandsworth factory's disappearance also reflects a wider British story. Many companies did not vanish completely. Their names survived as brands, licenses, assets, and memories. But the work moved. The buildings changed use. The communities around them lost the daily presence of production. What remained was often a logo detached from the place that gave it substance. Airfix is therefore both a survival story and a loss story. It survived because people cared enough for the name to be rescued, relaunched and reimagined. It was not erased. New kits still appear. Old subjects return. Builders still open boxes, study instructions, and turn parts into objects. The ritual continues, but the old factory world and the London site, the mass childhood market, the post-war patience, the Woolworths shelf, the sense that British industry could be held in miniature belongs to another time. And perhaps that is why Airfix remains so powerful. A completed model is always smaller than the thing it represents. But sometimes a miniature can reveal the scale of what has been lost. The Airfix factory made tiny aircraft, tiny ships, tiny tanks, tiny cars, and tiny soldiers. But behind those small objects was a large story. Of refugees and plastics, of Woolworths and Wandsworth, of post-war childhood, of British manufacturing, of corporate rescue, of industrial decline, and of memory that refuses to disappear. Airfix did not simply sell models. It sold the feeling that the world could be understood by taking it piece by piece, holding it carefully, and building it with your own hands. If you enjoyed this story and want more documentaries about the factories, industries, and forgotten companies that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support would be much appreciated.